Member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the House. This is an uncontroversial bill which simply consolidates four pieces of legislation which govern export quotas and allows for quota certification arrangements for agriculture to be carried out under one set of powers. Australia, of course, is a great producer of food and fibre product. We are so despite the fact that we have many challenges as a food-producing nation. We are challenged by water scarcity. We have less than optimal soil quality despite broader public perception. Certainly we do have some very rich soils in certain locations, but because of our geographical history, on average our soils are poor compared to some of our competitors. And of course we have vast distances between the farm gate and our markets, both our domestic markets and our export markets. Yet despite all of that, the value of our farm output for an island nation of only 23 or 24 million people is $50 billion annually, or more than $50 billion. And our exports are more than $30 billion. In other words, we export around 2/3 of all the food product we produce. This, of course, while we should always be cautious and alert to our food security issues, it is the reason that chatter about food security in this country, while certainly a global issue, is rather silly because it's not one of our challenges in food production, which is made clear by the fact that we export 2/3 of everything we produce. It's also why much of the debate around foreign ownership is so silly. Rather, if we are to grow our agricultural opportunities, we will need a lot of investment in agriculture over the coming decades, and with a small population with a limited savings capacity, by necessity much of that investment will need to come from other sources, as it always has done in all of our history as a country and indeed as a colony. There are many things, Mr Deputy Speaker, that will determine the extent of our success in agriculture over the coming decades, and many of them go to the key issues in the bill today, or rather the things that the bill today help to govern. It's not an exhaustive list, but I've just written down many of them. The first is the extent to which government is willing and able to provide leadership and strategic guidance in this increasingly globally competitive market. That will be critical. The second is the effectiveness of the management of our limited natural resources, most importantly our water and soil resources. The question in the future will be how we do more with ever-depleting water and soil resources. We are already the driest continent on Earth, and it is clear, while I'm happy on another occasion to debate the reasons, it's clear that our water challenges are becoming greater. Australia is becoming a drier continent. Our droughts are becoming more protracted, and of course we're entering into another El Niño period, which means that those challenges are going to become greater. Of course, we need more focus on how we better manage our soils, including our capacity to retain water in our soils. And of course, everything we do in agricultural planning has to take into account sustainability, how we ensure that those resources are available to us for many, many decades to come. The third is our performance in research and development and extension, and of course our embrace of biotechnology, which will be critical to our future success. The fourth is our willingness to accept more consolidation and corporatisation in the sector. This is of some concern to some who are committed to the concept of a family farm. Family farms will continue to play a critical role in the decades ahead. In fact, much of our innovation typically comes from the family farm. But it's a reality of the sector that further consolidation will be necessary, and further corporatisation and the skills and networks that brings, and of course the investment it brings, will be very, very critical. The fifth is the extent to which we are able to lift productivity and our cost competitiveness. That comment speaks for itself. The sixth is our efforts in dealing with our workforce challenges. We have an ageing population generally. We have an ageing workforce population generally, but in particular, this is a very, very significant challenge in Australian agriculture. And as I often say, people ask me, how do we bring young people back to the farm? My simple answer is they'll come back to the farm when there's good money to be made. It's as simple as that, I think, for younger generations. The seventh is our success in securing and growing export markets, which is obvious. And the eighth is the extent to which we are successful in our attempts to move our food and fibre products up the value chain. In other words, for a country like Australia, which is a net exporter, and a country with limited natural resources and a limited population, our real future won't so much be in volume, as important as that will be, but in value. In other words, the margin we receive on each of our food and fibre products, the extent to which we are able to profit. And we're seeing that already. For example, dairy products into Asia, where the growing middle classes are prepared to pay big dollars for something we make at a relatively low price. And of course other major products like beef, where Wagyu products and products which might have marbling with low containing low fat content fat, these are the things that the Asians, for example, the middle class of Asia, will pay big dollar for, and they're the areas in which we will get premium. There are myriad of other examples. Udon noodles out of our grains industry, again, a premium will be paid for specific varieties of our wheat. So pushing up the value chain will be absolutely critical. So that brings me back to the bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because there's been a lot of talk recently about the opportunities presented now to us by various free trade agreements, obviously the most recent ones, South Korea, Japan and China. These, of course, aren't free trade agreements, they are preferential trade agreements. All of us in this place, I'm sure, are united in that we would like to see more unilateral, multilateral agreements rather than bilateral agreements, because bilateral agreements, of course, are only a fight between nation states about who gets access at what price. And what chapter and the Korean and the Japanese, the Japan agreements are really about is making sure that we have access on the same playing field, or at the same level playing field as our major competitors. In other words, it doesn't cost us any more to get our product into China, for example, than it does our competitors in North or South America. In other words, the quota we have put on our product is no greater than those of our competitors. And now this is very, very important, of critical importance. But the challenge for us doesn't, of course, end there, because as we all know, it's not just about the tariff barriers, it's also about the non-tariff barriers and all the technical aspects that go with our attempts to export to other markets. Now, we've dealt with these issues for many years, and hopefully we are getting better at this game. But the reality is that we won't benefit from chapter and those other free trade agreements until we've dealt with all those non-tariff barriers. Now, everyone in this place has ownership of those agreements. The former Labor government, of course, spent 6 years moving towards a final outcome on each of those free trade agreements. What we now need to do is work together to overcome the technical barriers. So, to simplify it, the Department of Trade, Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade has done its work, gaining the access by getting arrangements on the quotas, but now the Department of Agriculture and the Agriculture Minister has much work to do to secure the relevant protocols that are required to overcome those non-technical barriers. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, it concerns me that this work appears to be taking place very, very slowly. It's all right for the Agriculture Minister to get up during question time and claim all these wonderful things are happening as a result of the signing of chapter and other agreements, and some good things, of course, are happening. But many other commodities are still locked out of China, South Korea and Japan because the technical barriers to export have not been overcome. Now, I've got a chart here, a table here with me, which was produced by the peak industry body AusVeg, representing Australian vegetable growers. And what it shows is each of our exporting nations and then a breakdown of each of the vegetable commodities, carrots, cauliflower, broccoli, beans and so on, right through to potatoes. And the alarming thing about this chart is that for the China market, for example, there are 12 commodities, and not one of those commodities is shaded green. Green indicates that effective phytosanitary protocols now exist. In other words, of 12 vegetable commodities, still not one has access to the China market. 2 are shaded yellow, indicating that restrictive phytosanitary protocols exist, but the rest are shaded red. So nothing could more clearly indicate than this table that we have a long way to go yet before the full benefits of the agreements we've secured with these other nation states can be realised. And so the real test for this minister and this government now will be the speed at which those protocols can be negotiated and, of course, the effectiveness of those protocols. The effectiveness, of course, is just as important as the lowering of the barriers, the tariff barriers and indeed the associated quotas are and can be. Now, the other question, of course, is the cost of doing business, and the reality of exporting is that there are associated costs, and there are substantial associated costs which go beyond the obvious costs like transport. In this country, and it's a good system, much of the work around things like phytosanitary protocols are done by government, and the cost of doing that work is recovered from industry, and that is a reasonable arrangement and a very effective arrangement. But government has to continue to strive to ensure that those costs are as low as is possible. Already in this country, we have some difficulty in being cost competitive because of our geography, our population, and the high standard we rightly put on the contribution of our workforce, both in remuneration and, of course, in terms of safety. Now, I'm really concerned, Mr Deputy Speaker, that recently the government has decided to review some of these costs. And I was astounded to learn that post that review, some of those costs have doubled for Australian exporters. Doubled for Australian exporters. Now, I'm delighted that the Minister has now recognised that we have a problem here, and extraordinarily he's now sought an independent review of the review, a process I don't think that would leave the Australian taxpayer particularly impressed. But it's a concern, or should be a concern to all of us, that a minister should allow the department to review the cost sign off on the new cost regime and then immediately seek to contract out the review of the review. This is not something which instills confidence in those seeking new export opportunities and to grow export opportunities in other markets around the world. So the role here for government will be a very substantial one, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it starts with the first point I made about what will determine the extent of our success, and that is leadership and strategic direction from government. This is something that was lacking in the relatively recent agricultural white paper, a white paper that should have taken a big picture approach, should have sent messages about where the government wanted to take agriculture into the future, sent messages about where it was prepared to provide the path of least resistance, how it would attract investment in the most relevant sectors, how it would make sure that we had an efficient allocation of resources, our limited natural resources in this country. All these things were missing. It's all right for the Agriculture Minister to stand at the dispatch box during question time and claim credit for things that happened 20 years ago in airports that were privately built, in which he can claim no credit, and to claim credit for drought-induced cattle prices. But agriculture needs far more than that. It does need strategic guidance from government. It does need sound planning. And what it doesn't need is the government sending a signal in a very competitive market for foreign capital that foreign capital is not welcome in this country. That's what it's been determined to do in recent months. It's playing to the crowd. It's playing on fear in our community that somehow Asian investment in agriculture is not good for this country. Rather, it should be showing leadership. It should be going out there and saying, we need this investment and we're in competition with others for it. Without that investment, we can't be internationally competitive and we won't be exporting more. We won't be pushing our agricultural products up the value curve. And you need not fear, because we export 2/3 of everything we grow and they can't pick the land up and take it with them, which is exactly the point Minister Robb made last week in response to the government's decision on the land holdings of S. Kidman and Co. We should be working together in this place to send a very, very clear message to the Australian community that they should not fear foreign investment in our agricultural land or our agribusinesses in this country. And indeed, we desperately need that investment in this country, and without it, we will fall further behind. Now, I understand Minister Robb expressing concern about the Kidman decision. I've said publicly that if the Kidman decision was based on concerns about national security, for example, the proximity of some of the land holdings to some of our more sensitive defence facilities, then I accept it absolutely. As a former Defence Minister and a member of the National Security Committee of the Cabinet, I understand that better than most in this place. But I fear it was about more than that, Mr Deputy Speaker. I fear it was also about this government's determination to build its political popularity in the region by sending the message that Australian agriculture is not open for business to Asian investment in particular. In this country, for the first time in our history, we have a discriminatory foreign investment review regime. One rule for our historic Western partners and another rule for those investing from Asia. And I want to remind the House of one very significant point. It doesn't matter what the screening threshold is for the Foreign Investment Review Board. The Treasurer has the power to review any investment proposal in this country he cares to review. He doesn't need a threshold. He doesn't need a trigger. Indeed, he doesn't need the Foreign Investment Review Board. Yes, he should look to the advice of the Foreign Investment Review Board and the experts which sit on it and behind it within Treasury. But there's nothing to stop the Treasurer from reviewing or vetoing, indeed, any proposal that comes before that board. What this threshold lowering to $15 million for agricultural land will do is clog the system and increase costs for investors. That will cause investors to go elsewhere where the returns are just as good, but the pathway is easier because the government there is more inviting of that investment. So I once again appeal to this government to give up this folly, to stop seeking this political outcome, to stop playing to the crowd, and recognise, as the member for Hume did in his seminal document Greening Pastures, where he recognised that to meet all of our aspirations in agriculture, we will need $600 billion, that's with a B, billion dollars of investment in this country by 2050. And it's not going to come from within. Not even if all of our super funds decided tomorrow, Mr Deputy Speaker, to put all their money into agriculture. It's not going to come from within. By necessity, it will come from foreign sources. We are in competition with others, and we need to be inviting of it. Discerning of it? Absolutely, but inviting of it. So this bill goes to this bill represents one of the many, many things that will go to our attractiveness as an export destination and as an investment destination, our cost competitiveness on international markets, but it's only a very small part of it, a very, very small part of it. Minister Joyce has to stop claiming credit for things he hasn't done, and he needs to get out of the way and let Australian agriculture grow and let foreign investment play its role. The opposition supports the bill before the House.
The question